Good morning, everyone. My name is Rodney Fong, and I'm the President and CEO of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining our first live webinar. It's great to see so many people logged on today. The Chamber is excited to share an opportunity to come to you, to come into your living room in your PJs. This is an opportunity for us to share our business resources during this very difficult and trying time. Our team has been working hard to advocate for our community. We are here for you. And we encourage you to join us, to join the Chamber of Commerce, so we can all get through this together, because we are going to be stronger together to rebuild San Francisco. While this is the first broadcast, this is part 3 of a 3-part series on the stimulus package. The first 2 are available recorded on our website at sfchamber.com. And so we encourage you to stay tuned for future topics and webinars that the Chamber is going to produce. We're going to do them weekly, and they're going to be interesting topical subject matter. So please follow us. At this time, I'd like to turn over to our Director of Public Policy, Jay Chang. Jay, take it away.
Thanks, Rodney. Hi, everybody in webinar land. It's good to see you, kind of, through Zoom. We really appreciate you joining and being part of our first live webinar. As Rodney mentioned, this is actually part 3 of a series. You can catch our first 2 parts with Mayor London Breed's office and Senator Dianne Feinstein's office about the COVID-19 pandemic. But, you know, being private sector professionals, we know that the most honest way to hear feedback about COVID-19 and the work that government's doing is to hear it from private sector professionals. And so we're very, very excited to have Monument Advocacy here with us today. I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items to ensure that we have a smooth experience for everyone. I'm sure by week 2 of COVID-19 shelter in place, this is not a new rodeo for any of us. So all participants have been muted upon arrival and during the duration of the webinar. This is not because we don't love to hear your voice, but this is to preserve the audio quality for everyone involved. To ask questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We were going to do our best to answer all questions during the webinar, but if we don't get to your questions, we will follow up with you post-webinar. And this is the magic of online virtual webinars. To chat with participants, use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to have an ongoing chat throughout this webinar, and we're going to do our best to engage with that chat as that webinar occurs. You can talk about how great my hair looks today. This webinar is going to be recorded, and the recording will be emailed post-webinar. So if you don't quite remember something that one of our participants shared today, don't worry, you can go back and record it and watch it again on our YouTube channel. A couple of things from Monument Advocacy, some housekeeping announcements on that front. First, this presentation was designed as a broad overview. The government continues to provide updated guidance and technical clarifications, and as we all learned, this is an evolving crisis, and so things change day by day. So everything we say today is accurate as of this moment, but may not be accurate in the next hour. So kind of keep that in mind as we go forward. If there's items that we can't address today because of those dynamics, we're happy to track down an answer and follow up with you. Feel free to reach out with our public policy team. I want to take this time to introduce Monument Advocacy and our speakers today. Monument Advocacy is a boutique bipartisan government relations and public affairs firm based in DC with offices on the West Coast in San Francisco and Seattle. They're a proud San Francisco Chamber member. More importantly, we are proud to have them. From Monument Advocacy today, we have Gideon Lett, who leads Monument's San Francisco offices and is a recognized leader in bridging the divide between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C., with an extensive background working at the intersection of technology and public policy. He's an active member of our Chamber's Public Policy Committee and happy to field any follow-up questions or other items after this call. We have T.A. Hawks, who is a partner with Monument after nearly 15 years in the Senate, with roles that included Chief of Staff to former Appropriations Chairman Thad Cochran, and Staff Director of Senate Agricultural Committee. We have Kimberly Ellis, a tax, trade, and health policy expert, having served as Legislative Director for Congressman Kevin Brady, now ranking member on the House Ways and Means, and as a senior aide to the U.S. Trade Representative under President Bush. And we have Matt McAlvana. I apologize for that.
It's a tough one. Don't worry about it.
I'm sorry. It's a tough one. I'm sorry. But what I lack in his name, he makes up with prestige and experience. He is a former Obama administration official, having served as an assistant U.S. trade representative, Matt also spent more than 8 years on Capitol Hill as an aide to Senator Pat Murray, working to advance policy efforts through the Senate Democratic leadership and her roles on the Senate Budget, Appropriations, and Veteran Affairs Committee. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Matt to take it away from us.
Great, thank you, Rodney and Jay. Hope everybody can hear me well. I am in process here of sharing my screen with everyone. Give me just 1 second. And there we are. Does everybody see that? Great. So thank you again to Rodney and Jay. One other public service announcement. The three presenters from Monument today, Kimberly and TA and myself, all have children between the age of about 18 months and grammar school. So the possibility of an interruption today is high, but I'm sure that all you guys are getting pretty used to that at this point. We are really excited to mention this is more of a broad overview of what we've seen so far in terms of the stimulus bills. There have now been 3 major stimulus bills, and we're in conversations today, including some debate on the Senate floor this morning on a 4th phase, and we will touch on all of that. Folks you will hear from today, again, Jay was kind enough to give an announcement, and we're hoping that Jay was kind enough to give introductions, and we're hoping that Gideon will be on the line later to wrap things up for us. What we will cover today, first and foremost, we'll go through the early coronavirus responses. This is what we'll refer to as phase 1 and 2. We will then go into depth on phase 3, otherwise known as the CARES Act. That's really where a lot of the meat so far of the legislative action has been taken. The PPP loan program, which I know is top of mind for so many businesses, small and large. We will walk through that. We will walk through the broader $454 billion in funding that was provided to larger businesses as an injection, particularly those that are in economically distressed sectors. We will walk through the direct payments, which certainly many Americans, 90% of whom will get a check, are wondering how much and when they will get those checks. We will walk through some of the broad social safety net provisions, some of the food safety programs, as well as some of the support for frontline healthcare workers. And then finally, we will take a little bit of a look ahead. Right now, there's discussion of an interim package that would plus up that PPP program. And I will make sure that we get into that. And then we will talk about some other trade, tax, and other provisions that could be, that could be discussed as part of the next phase. So to start off phase 1, which was enacted March 3rd and was $8.3 billion. Phase 1 was almost entirely a healthcare response. While this was passed a little over a month ago, this seems like a completely different world. The broad majority of the funding in this $8.3 billion package went to HHS for diagnostic testing, frontline healthcare workers. This was the first phase that included small additional assistance for SBA and their disaster loan program, which we'll talk about a little bit further. This included support for CDC around vaccine research as well. Politically, the big argument around this one was the Trump administration had requested around $2 billion for this initial package, and congressional Democrats came back with a much larger number. But $8.3 billion, as you guys know, given the numbers that we're tossing around right now, is simply a drop in the bucket. Phase 2 was enacted on March 18th. This was $100 billion, and this was really the first recognition that folks are not going to be able to go back to work. There were significant increases in unemployment insurance, particularly to help states administrate the volume of unemployment claims that were coming in. There were significant plus ups to food assistance programs, particularly the SNAP program. And there was also some support to stop the spread internationally. But really the biggest component of phase two and the $100 billion was new requirements for smaller employers to offer both paid sick and family leave. And Kimberly Ellis, who Jay introduced earlier, is going to talk a little bit more about those sick leave and family leave policies.
Sure. Thanks so much, Matt. Nice to be with you all today. So as Matt mentioned, there's a number of new requirements for employers that have employees below that 500 threshold. They're required to offer 2 weeks of paid leave, and that's at full wages if they're under an order to stay at home because of COVID, and 2/3 wages if they're caring for a family member or a child who's either sick or their child care facility or school is closed. And then it also expands the Family Medical and Leave Act for an additional 10 weeks to apply to that same group of individuals impacted by COVID, again, who were sick themselves, who were caring for a family member or a child, or under a stay-at-home order. And that is 2/3 wages, but it also has limits that employers can certainly pay above, but at the same time, the government recognizes that employers are going to need help to offset these additional costs if they want to retain their employees for that period. And they're offering refundable tax credits to offset those costs. And if a business needs additional cash before they're able to offset the tax credit, there's ways to do that if you go to irs.gov, as you may have already seen. And again, those are capped at different amounts, again, depending on whether the employee is a full-time worker or a part-time worker, again, caring, directly impacted by COVID, stay-at-home order, or caring for a child or family member. So there's various rules and regulations around all of those, and DOL, the Department of Labor, also has a role in designating waivers for employers with fewer than 50 employees as well. So if this does impact you, encourage you to go to the DOL website, and they have laid out the regulations, again, governing both those larger employers, but under 500, and those who are under 50, who may need some additional flexibilities as they try to stay up to date on all these different roles. And I think I'm turning things over now to TA, who's going to talk a little bit about what was in the CARES Act. This is the phase 3 larger package. TA?
Yeah, so in the phase 3 version of the bill, the CARES Act, as Kimberly just said, they began working on this, the White House and Capitol Hill, before they were even done with the second package. And I think it was a recognition that while the first two were immediate and tried to be targeted, that the economy was in such a tailspin that they really needed to do more to address the bigger underlying issues in the economy. So this package was drafted initially by Republicans, but they looped in Democratic senators using a task force model. But then negotiations started really in earnest with the White House and Speaker Pelosi, and all this, even with negotiations and trading things back and forth, all this happened in about a week, and the total amount included was over $2 trillion. So SBA and Treasury and many of the government agencies that are tasked with implementing the CARES Act are still writing rules to get the money out. Next slide. So one of the largest public-facing programs in the CARES Act was the SBA Paycheck Protection program that we sort of lay out an overview of here. The Senate Small Business Committee wrote this with Democratic and Republican input, and it was really meant to address companies with 500 employees or fewer but sole proprietorships as well as independent contractors were also dealt with in this set of provisions. These are loans that you probably read a lot about. They're 100% backed by the federal government and will be fully forgiven if funds are used for payroll costs, interest on mortgages, rent, and utilities. Funding covers the area for the range from February 15th until June 30th if you can show harm. And you can borrow 250% of the average monthly payroll up to $10 million. The SBA and Treasury did do a few things once the bill was passed, and they've gone to the implementation phase that tried to limit some of the use of this fund. They now say that 75% of the forgivable amount must be used for payroll. So as I mentioned, you can include mortgage, rent, utility, all those costs, but the forgivable amount has to stay above 75% for payroll. But on the parts that aren't forgivable, it's a 2-year loan at a 1% interest rate. So they've addressed the real concern with people who need stock and are trying to use the infusion of cash for immediate needs. This is all done under banks that are approved by the SBA, and we've seen even non-bank institutions be added to that program as recently as today. But for you all who need to find a lender, if you don't already have a lender, they have a very clear website that is searchable. And I looked this morning, and I could find in Washington, D.C., hundreds of banks, in my area that if I needed a loan, I could turn to. It's under sba.gov/paycheck protection/find. And as of yesterday, 3,600 lenders have procured or processed 381,000 applications totaling $100 billion. Today we saw Treasury approve a Main Street lending program. Oh, sorry, I'm skipping ahead. Matt, will you scoot up to the next slide? Yeah, just like the provisions in the slides we just focused on, one segment of the economy, small businesses. This section, the larger focus and the $500 billion was meant for larger businesses, including airlines and some of the others that we've all read a lot about. $32 billion are allocated to the airlines, air cargo, and contractors. But the largest provisions go to the Federal Reserve to expand lending and enhance liquidity on the market. Treasury today announced a Main Street, Treasury in consult with the Fed announced the Main Street Business Lending Program and a municipal liquidity facility. The Main Street program would use $75 billion included in the CARES Act to enable up to $600 billion in financing for medium-sized businesses. So these are the ones from 500 to 10,000 employees, or $2.5 billion in 2019 annual revenues. Those loans are anywhere from $1 million to $25 million. And the municipal liquidity facility, Treasury will use $35 billion to provide up to $500 billion in direct financing to states, counties, cities, and this will be used to offset the losses that so many areas have seen due to tax revenue declines. And then there are a few other programs that I'll just highlight very quickly. There's a mutual fund liquidity, there's a privacy market, corporate credit facility, and secondary market corporate credit facilities. Those are both spending about $75 billion, and a term asset backed security loan facility at $10 billion. All these programs are still being rolled out, as I said, some of these even today. So we will likely have to get additional information from Treasury if there are questions about some of those larger scale programs.
Thanks, TA. I'm going to turn back and highlight a couple of more provisions included in the CARES Act that were aimed to help both businesses, large and small. On the tax side, the CARES Act is going to allow employers to defer the employer side of the payroll taxes they pay on their employees through the end of 2020, and then they have essentially 2 years to pay those back, with 50% due next year and then the following year. You've also seen a lot of talk, at the beginning of the CARES Act, and the president talked a little bit about this as well, in terms of will there be a payroll tax cut? Certainly not something under discussion for the next phase, but you could see more conversations around that in the future. But in terms of what was in the actual legislation, it's just a deferral in the payroll taxes. They also included, for those businesses who for some reason do not want to or cannot take advantage of the Small Business Paycheck Protection Program, they are able to access an employee retention tax credit that will help provide extra cash and to those businesses that keep their employees. And it's a 50% tax credit on wages paid to those employees, and it's taken against future payroll payments. So again, more details on that at our irs.gov, including what businesses can be eligible for that employee retention tax credit. For the small business side, the CARES Act also approved 2 additional programs that, again, trying to offer maximum flexibilities to those businesses who need it, is the economic injury disaster loans. And these are lower interest loans of up to $2 million. They've got the principal interest deferment up to 4 years. So it has, again, some additional flexibilities, and more details on that can be found, as TA mentioned, at SBA.gov. And for those businesses who need, cash immediately up to $10,000, they can also apply for an economic injury grant. And again, the idea here is to get cash immediately out to businesses, again, up to that amount as soon as possible, to help them meet those immediate needs as they're also seeking those longer term loans. And then next slide. Unemployment assistance. So for those employees who have been furloughed or laid off, so furlough employees can still apply for unemployment assistance even as they're receiving benefits such as healthcare from their employers. And this is going to range state by state, but Congress wanted to up the amount, so no one would receive less than, who applied and received unemployment insurance would receive less than $600 per week for all recipients. And so this is under a new temporary and pandemic employment assistance program, and it also expands to those workers not traditionally eligible for unemployment benefits, including those who are self-employed, gig economy workers, contractors, and the like. So this is a pretty big change to the unemployment assistance program. And it includes an additional 13 weeks as well. So in addition to those plus ups, expanding eligibility, and additional weeks of unemployment assistance to try to get people through the current crisis. And again, everyone has to play by state, so it all ranges a little bit differently, but those are at least the overview of how the federal program is helping to assist those states in requiring those plus ups.
Thanks, Kimberly.
Yeah.
So yeah, and the next phase is the direct payments to Americans, which I mentioned earlier, is the topic that everybody's talking about. An estimated 90% of Americans will receive these checks. The checks will be $1,200 for individuals with income up to $75,000. Couples with income up to $150,000 will receive $2,400. That number, once you go over the cap, will be phased out by 5%. And I'll show you a chart here in a second where you can estimate what that phase out will be and what amount your check will be. The amount will increase by $500 for every child you have as well. The big question here is when do the checks go out? Secretary Mnuchin said yesterday that for those who have filed tax returns in 2018 or 2019 who included their direct deposit information, those checks will start going out next week. That is an aggressive timeline. We will see if Treasury follows through. The last time there was a direct payment program to Americans was under the George W. Bush administration, and it took 6 weeks. So if they can turn these around within 3 weeks to those who have given direct deposit information, that will be a pretty quick timeline. The question, though, is those, there was an estimated, I think, 60 million Americans who provided direct deposit information. For those who have not and will receive traditional paper checks. The Treasury Secretary was pretty honest. They may not get a check until as late as August. So the IRS is setting up a portal where Americans can go on and provide their direct deposit information, provide their bank routing number so that they can get that check quicker. One update that we saw last week also was, for eligibility purposes, you would have to have filed, again, a tax return in 2018 or 2019. A lot of Social Security recipients, where Social Security is their only form of income, don't file a tax return. Treasury Secretary has pointed out that they will receive checks through their Social Security filings as well. This is the chart that I talked about, where you can kind of guesstimate what exactly your check amount will be, if this is applicable for any of the folks on the line or for their employees. Again, I think we're going to be sharing this deck with the chamber so that you can pass on this chart. But we found this helpful in sharing with a number of our clients. Certainly share with you guys. I would be, I think, remiss, and TA and Kimberly hop in here at any point if you want, but there are a number of programs within the CARES Act that are just direct social safety net and healthcare funding streams. Hospitals, obviously, seeing significant shortfall. So there was $100 billion provided for hospitals and healthcare providers that is distributed programmatically by need. So certainly Bay Area hospitals will be receiving a significant portion of funding, as will hospitals in Seattle, New York, and other hotspots. $27 billion, this is on top of what was in the additional phases for vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostic testing. $30 billion for school and universities for response efforts. A lot of that is for online learning capabilities. Obviously, a lot of schools, not so much universities, but a lot of high schools really do have to build out their facilities in that respect. And that is where a lot of that funding will go to. $48 billion for transportation and housing. On the transportation front, a lot of local communities, and as I'm sure the BART is, are seeing significant funding shortfalls because of the lack of ridership. Some of this funding and some of the state stabilization funding that is in the CARES Act is going to be provided to those transportation and transit systems. The VA, as I'm sure many of you guys have seen in recent articles, is really struggling at this point. So there was funding for equipment, tests, and services. Didn't put it on the slide, but tribal authorities also received significant funding for similar healthcare facilities. And then $15.5 billion in additional SNAP funding. We were all reading the articles about the lines at food banks across the country. I don't think anybody thinks that this $15.5 billion is going to be the end of the SNAP funding. And TA works, with Feeding America, actually, who's a client of ours. And he could talk more if anybody has questions about any of the food security issues. And then, as I mentioned, states and municipalities will receive $150 billion in this. Democrats right now are fighting to include even more for states and municipalities. Again, this is mainly for budgetary shortfalls. Here's a little chart that I also found helpful and that we can pass on. This basically breaks down what portion of the CARES Act were loans and what were direct payments or grants. The grants are in red, the loans are in the darker blue, and then the light blue is programmatic government funding. That's basically funding that was going to government programs that are already in existence, where the CARES Act just provided additional funding. So you see on the grants side, the single biggest direct payment will go to the stimulus checks to Americans. Unemployment, the $250 billion to provide the extra $600 in extra eligibility at the state level is a significant funding stream, $250 billion. And then tax deferrals and extended deadlines are a spend, 221 billion. In terms of loans, the PPP program at 349 billion is a little bit of a hybrid between a grant and a loan, because as TA mentioned, the 8 weeks at least that are covered for payroll mortgages are fully forgivable. So that is, like I said, a little bit of a hybrid. And then the funding for distressed economic sectors, airlines, tourism, those are largely in the form of grants. So what's next? I'm going to turn it back over to TA once again to talk a little bit about phase 4. And TA, I'll jump in here on some of the Democratic viewpoints if you want to start us off.
Yeah. So the subtitle there is "May not be as bipartisan as previous bills," and that has been proven to be the case even today. So some of the things that didn't get done in phase 3 that folks expected to be in phase 4 have sort of taken a side, been slid to the side a little bit. As Matt kind of laid out earlier, there are some things that Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer, want to do in the next package. But I think that was, we'll get into this a little bit later, but you even saw the president talking about big infrastructure spending. And, that was in a time when everybody thought, oh, we passed this $2 trillion bill and things will sort of, get back to normal. And that's obviously not been the case. But we say in here at the very bottom, Speaker Pelosi would like to get her bill on the floor by the end of April. And, what some of the things that she wants to do are laudable and good, and transportation and funding for wastewater and water systems were all part of that. But I think some of it will be held over to a package number 5 is most likely.
And I'll hop in here. I mean, this is basically what we saw this morning play out on the Senate floor. So right now, Congress is working not on kind of a full phase 4, but what they're calling an interim package. Republicans believe that interim package should include primarily the PPP lending program and an additional, I believe it is $350 billion allotment. The PPP lending program, as TA may have mentioned earlier, is bleeding funding. It is something that is very popular. It is oversubscribed. It will likely run out of funding in April. I don't think anybody thought that the initial funding stream would be enough. So the Republicans brought a bill to the floor to add that $350 billion, and it would have to be passed by unanimous consent. As you guys all know, nobody's in Washington, D.C. right now. So anything that does come up has to be passed unanimously. So Democrats actually went to the floor and objected to passing just the $350 billion allotment. They're looking for a larger spend in this interim package. The things that they would like to add are a guarantee that $125 billion of the overall $250 billion PPP addition goes specifically to small businesses that are women-owned, that are minority-owned, that are veteran-owned, that serve farmers, that serve rural areas. They want to see additional stipulations, qualifications on that additional on the additional funding that's been requested. They would also like to add $100 billion for healthcare facilities and workers. This is primarily for frontline responders, for PPE, and for ventilators and other things that we're seeing shortfalls of at some of the hospitals and hotspots. They would like to see an additional $150 billion for state and local government funding. This is the funding that I mentioned before, that is for budgetary shortfalls. This is particularly important to Senator Schumer. for political reasons, given that Governor Cuomo has been such a kind of breakout star around this crisis, and for obvious reasons. New York and other states obviously need a lot of additional funding. And then they're asking for a 15% increase to the maximum SNAP benefit. And, as we pointed out, the stress that we've seen on food banks. This is going to become a negotiation. Publicly, you will see Republicans pointing out that Democrats are delaying funding for the PPP lending program. I'm sure that they will be pointing to some of the small businesses who are either being turned away or struggling to access the program, while Democrats will point out the need at hospitals, at the state and local level, and at food banks. And then the last bullet, with Congress out till the 20th, they need to come around something that is not going to be objected to, not only in the Senate, but that Speaker Pelosi and the full House caucus will bless without having to come back into town.
Yeah, so just to add a little bit on that, I think questions immediately turn today to what happens now. The Senate voted down this package. What's gonna happen? And because, as Matt said, these are programs that are oversubscribed, we fully expect that the White House and Speaker Pelosi and Leader McConnell and Schumer will all sort of lock themselves in rooms over the next few days. The Senate, under their sort of arcane rules, they can only meet every 3 days, 3 legislative days when they're out of session. So the next time they could do something is on Monday. And then after that, it would be Thursday again of next week. So, as Matt said, and as we mentioned here on this screen, there's more PPP that is needed, and it's needed pretty quickly. And we expect those negotiations are ongoing. And with a greater focus, as Matt mentioned, on some of the financial institutions that the speaker highlighted in her proposal. Today's action also on the municipal liquidity and bond sales will likely not be the end of that conversation either. As Matt pointed out earlier, there may be grants that are considered as part of a next package. What could come next is likely direct funding to states, not just through bond markets. We also learned today that 6.6 million Americans filed for unemployment last week, which means roughly 10 million over the last 3 weeks have filed unemployment claims. So there's likely to be an additional infusion of dollars to that program too. And it's always possible, as we mentioned here, that more direct payments, if economists suggest that is a good way to prime the pump of the economy, there's likely to be an additional round of checks for Americans.
And just to be clear again, there is this interim package that's being worked on right now. We would guess, based on the Republicans' request and the Democratic counteroffer, that that's somewhere between $200 and $600 billion, that it mainly focuses on PPP, but potentially has some additions. That is going to be separate from what phase 4 will be, which will likely be a continuation of a lot of the CARES Act or phase 3 programs. And that potentially, that bill could potentially come together in May or in late April, when Congress potentially is back here in town. And you could see even more funding for PPP in that. As the slide points out, you could see more funding for state stabilization. There certainly will be calls for additional checks to Americans. There will be likely a need, based on the filings, for additional unemployment benefits. So all of which, will get dealt with after this interim package. So sort of TBD on that front, based on how large the interim package is.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Matt. And and for those provisions that are going to be kind of under discussion for these future packages, on the trade and tax front, certainly Speaker Pelosi had been talking earlier this month about, what else can we do on the tax side to offer relief for Americans. One thing that she has long fought for is trying to get a rollback of the cap on the state and local tax deduction, which is set at $10,000 after the tax reform bill passed a couple of years ago. That's certainly seen as a politically blue state, red state issue, and something that was, when she raised it again, was rejected by Republicans in Congress who had drafted the tax law. Those type of kind of larger tax discussions, provisions are going to get delayed a little bit. It's not that they couldn't kind of come back in a future package, but those are part of probably a broader discussion on a tax bill in the future that's a little bit of a retooling of some of these provisions. There could be also some things though on, as we get to a bill that looks a little bit more sectoral in nature, again, maybe a phase 5 or 6 at this point, later this summer, as a way to try to stimulate different sectors of the economy and try to get people back to work as renewable energy incentives. There's some that are expiring. I know there's a number of different proposals in Congress to try to expand eligibility for a lot of these programs to include different plus-ups or different types of technologies in the renewable space. So that could certainly come back under discussion, as well as tax provisions that address some concern coming out of COVID related to supply chains and what does the U.S. need to be doing to protect those supply chains a little bit more? And are there different provisions in the tax code that can be crafted to incentivize or de-incentivize companies to manufacture here in the U.S. those kind of critical technologies, whether it's pharmaceutical or different medical supplies or PPE and the like. So all of these types of tax revisions, I think the conversation on those gets just delayed a little bit as they turn to kind of the immediate needs in the interim on the small business side and aid for hospitals and states and the like. But down the road, tariffs could also be a part of those discussions as well. A number of different members of Congress have pressed the president to enact a 90-day delay in tariff collections. There is a proposal in front of the president right now to consider that. It got a little bit of press last week, the week before. He has not yet made a decision. The last reports were that if he did make a decision, it would be only on MFN tariffs and not on tariffs subject to enforcement actions, which do include all of the China 301 tariffs, the steel and aluminum tariffs, et cetera. So if he did allow for a 90-day delay in tariff collection, it would likely be just on kind of the regular set of tariffs, not on these additional plus-ups that he's enacted. But something certainly to watch. And if this does come back around as kind of part of the discussion of one of these packages, Congress could certainly preempt him. But at the moment, they're just trying to pressure the president to enact some of these delays, and that would primarily benefit retail and apparel importers at this point who are already hurting. So I expect that to see that continue as part of the discussion as well. And certainly, on the technical side, they have been writing these bills so quickly. There's certainly going to be mistakes, even in how these programs are designed, how the tax provisions that they included worked, in concert with other provisions. So, there's going to be an element of technical corrections to this. So as you all are seeing issues accessing, particularly on the tax side, some of these programs, taking that to your member of Congress, working through the chamber is going to be really important, because all of these members are listening right now. They're listening to their constituents. They're listening to their businesses. They're trying to take in as much information right now as possible so they can, correct these issues in real time. So just something to think about as these discussions continue to evolve in Congress. And again, going back to infrastructure, as TA previewed, this has been, we joke here in DC every week seems to be infrastructure week, at least before COVID. This is something that in theory has a lot of bipartisan support, but the devil's always been in the details in terms of how you pay for it. But if given the crisis that we're in and the economic crisis that we're in, as we look to a recovery type package in the future, again, whether it's this summer, this fall, infrastructure certainly will be a part of that conversation. Members who who work on transportation committees are already working on what that might look like. How can you help some of these Americans who are not able to go back to work or in distressed industries, and how can you help stimulate the economy with some infrastructure spending? So you could certainly see this, I think, will continue to be a theme, but again, not for kind of these immediate bills where they're trying to plus up some of these programs and make sure that the liquidity and cash flow is working as quickly as possible. I think.
So just to kind of, thank you, Kimberly, just to kind of sum things up, a few things to keep in mind as we go forward. As I mentioned, phase 4 is definitely not the end. Well, even if there is a CARES package 2 that extends most of the programs in the CARES package, which, like I said, could be late April or May, there's still going to be additional stimulus packages. To tell the truth, to this point, every package that has been passed has been more about stopping the bleeding. We really haven't gotten into a true stimulus bill, the kinds that we passed post 2008, and that's where you would see infrastructure funding and other attempts to get folks back to work. So if you have ideas around stimulus proposals, as Kimberly mentioned, I think, you're a member of Congress, and there are some particularly powerful and influential ones in the Bay Area, will be all ears. The response really will define the upcoming congressional elections, if not the presidential election. We are already seeing that a lot of congressional offices are spending more time and energy on constituent response. They're really changing their offices into outreach programs. A lot of them are setting up portals on their website where individual businesses or employees can share their stories, can share their ideas. And certainly they're going to use a lot of that fodder for both legislation and rhetoric here in DC. The other thing I would say is the time to advocate is now. Members of Congress are looking for fresh ideas. If there aren't new and innovative ideas on what should be in the next stimulus package, it's quite possible that they just continue to go back to the well of what was in the CARES Act and continue to fund those programs rather than new programs. So it is really imperative that you get your ideas into the chamber and into your individual members of Congress as quickly as possible. So with that, I will pause. Jay or Rodney, or I don't know if Gideon has joined us on the line, but we would love to take questions. Turn it back over to you, Jay.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody. And thank you so much, Monument, for being here. We're going to just do, I know I'm cognizant of time, so we're just going to do 2 quick questions if possible. And first, I think we're all excited to get our direct payments and direct cash. I don't think any of us believe that $500 is enough to compensate us for all the homeschooling we've had to do for our children in the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks. The first is that we had a question around, we've had a lot of folks who've expressed having difficulties with getting their SBA loans from various reasons, or have applied to lenders and maybe not heard back, or we've heard stories in the media where lenders have had trouble connecting with the SBA. Do we feel like that's going to receive a resolution anytime soon? Are people in Washington working towards that?
Yeah, and to your point, Jay, I mean, the SBA website crashed multiple times in the first several days of PPP being released. So yes, I understand they've done website upgrades. I understand that they're working closely with their lenders, the banks that they most closely work with, and they're trying to make the reasons, the answers for consumers easier. That's why they had them go not to SBA, but to their local lender that they already had a relationship with. And I've answered a question during the chat session about your local bank, Wells Fargo, obviously is been, I'll address that real quickly, but has been one that has been under a tighter leash from the Fed. And the Fed, as of yesterday, did say that they were going to release Wells from some of their restrictions in order to get loans out to consumers. So I think hopefully in the week that the program has been live, things have gotten a little smoother. And I think, it's unfortunate when people aren't hearing back quickly, but hopefully they are going to hear more quickly as banks get the process under help so they can help get the lenders can work closely with SBA to get a quick answer for Americans.
I think the other thing, Jay, that I would mention on that is just it's a tremendous scale up. The existing SBA 7A loan program, I think, was in the neighborhood of $30 billion annually. So, I mean, it is a huge new number of loans that they're having to take on. The banks themselves haven't gotten clear regulatory guidance, and that's not necessarily on SBA or Treasury, given how quickly this bill came together. But there are obviously a ton of situational and hypothetical questions that are being thrown at both the banks and the government that just can't be answered at this point until SBA and Treasury provide more detail. And a lot of this is just a function of the fact that the bill came together in 7 days.
That's great. Thank you for that. And obviously, this is kind of an evolving piece. I want to get through a couple of quick, maybe logistical questions, right? Someone asked, is the payroll tax deferment automatic? Is that something that will just that deferment is assumed, or is that something you have to apply for?
Payroll, I think you would need to, I think it would be assumed, but you may need to check with the IRS or your accountant just to be sure. I think the IRS certainly can't imagine they would penalize anyone who took the deferment but didn't notify them. But again, just to be sure, I would check with your accountant or on the IRS.gov directly.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And I think, as we all know, San Francisco is the land of the gig economy, right? The land of the independent contractor and the sole proprietor. I know that some of these loans were actually, or some of these resources were actually designed for gig economy, independent contractor, sole proprietorship. Focus. Which one of those should people be looking at if they're in that category?
Certainly on the tax side, things like the employee retention tax credit is available to all, including some of those independent contractors. So that's certainly something I would look at on the tax side at least. And for any of those different loan programs, again, that would apply, then you should look at everything to see what those contractors are eligible for. TA, do you know on the SBA side as to what that process looks like?
The bill was pretty specific to make it as broad as possible and didn't want to leave gig workers out. So I think all of the maybe not all, obviously the Fed programs aren't specifically, but the SBA programs are designed for independent contractors, gig workers. So yes, you should, and most of them are able to be combined. So it's not like if you choose one, you are boxed out of the other. But obviously, you'd want to review all the rules and regs as they're coming out, make sure you're not, restricting your own options.
Yeah, and again,
and I think.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
No, I was going to say, and maybe this is what you're going to say. I think we mentioned it on the unemployment slide, but Congress. This is the first time that Congress has included gig workers in terms of unemployment eligibility. And really that is one critical thing that they should look at, given the fact that there is this extra $600 addition.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. I know we are almost out of time. And so Matt, if you want to close your share screen, we have we want to let people know about our webinar coming up. I'm going to do that real quick. First, I want to thank Monument Advocacy and everyone here for helping us with this, answering our questions, and doing this presentation. for all chamber members, if you ever need an expert in Washington, D.C., San Francisco, or Seattle, please think about Monument Advocacy. They definitely have great expertise in the issue. I also want to give a shout out to our shadow member of the panelists, Gideon Lett. If you ever need advocacy help in San Francisco, Gideon Lett is a great resource, and we work with him all the time. And so we deeply appreciate that. We know he's somewhere on this webinar, but we had a little bit of a technical difficulty, but we want to make sure that we give him enough credit and recognition for all the work that he's done to help put this together. A recording of this webinar and every other webinar we do will be posted on our website, sfchamber.com /virtual-events. That's virtual-events from the sfchamber.com URL. This recording is available along with part 1 and part 2 on our website. You will also be emailed this link, and I think we might have a chance to email the presentation as well. We'll check in with our Monument Advocacy folks around that. So please be sure to keep a lookout for more information. On the screen right here is our next webinar. It's our Small Business Weekly webinar series. If you're a small business and you have questions around legal considerations, we have a team of lawyers here to help answer your questions. It's like an online legal clinic, which I think at this point we all need. So check it out. It's April 15th, 11 a.m. And finally, the SF Chamber of Commerce is a little bit like NPR, right? We are a membership organization. We depend on your support. We are a resource here for you, and we're here to fight for you. So we ask you to join us by following us on social media, subscribe to our newsletters, join us in our fight for the business community, and most importantly, like NPR, we are a membership-driven organization. So consider becoming a member of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. We don't believe in membership drives where we just kind of lock everything down and bother you with membership calls all day long. So it's easier if you just proactively join as a member of the chamber and help us put on more great content like this. We're here for you no matter how large or small your business might be. Finally, I know there's a bunch of questions we didn't have a chance to get to today. We're really sorry about that. Feel free to reach out to our policy team. My email is jcheng@sfchamber.com. You can also find our emails on the website, sfchamber.com. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions, whether you're a member or not. We are here to help you. This is a time where all businesses need to come together and support each other. So we hope you're staying healthy and safe, and we hope you all have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.